Picture a book. It's heavy, bound in leather, and sits on a desk in a dimly lit monastery in 1486. It looks like any other religious text of the time, dense, scholarly, written in Latin. But this isn't a Bible, it's a weapon. The men who wrote it, two Dominican friars, didn't write it to save souls. They wrote it to hunt them. This book is the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of the Witches. Its purpose? To assert that your local healer, the woman who gave you herbs for your fever, hadn't just learned a trade, she had sold her soul to the devil. Before this book, magic was a messy, everyday part of life. But after the Malleus Maleficarum, the line was drawn in blood. This manual laid down the rules for interrogation, conviction, and punishment that would eventually fuel centuries of terror. Today, we're going to open the pages of history's most notorious manual. We're going to look at the world it destroyed, a world where cunning folk were neighbors, not monsters. And we're going to find out why the church decided that the only way to save the world was to burn parts of it down. To understand why this book was so devastating, you first have to understand what it was like to be alive in Europe just before the Renaissance kicked into high gear. Let's be honest, for most people, life was, by modern standards, short and incredibly uncomfortable. If you were living back then, you could expect to live to be about 35 years old. That was the average life expectancy. Imagine that. By the time you hit your mid-30s, you were already beating the odds. You likely lived in what we would consider slum conditions. But the real terror wasn't just the poverty, it was the disease. Disease was absolutely rife. Europe hadn't fully recovered from the trauma of the Black Death, which had run amok in the mid-14th century and wiped out between a third and a half of the entire population. So, you're living a precarious existence on the subsistence level. Your crops might fail. Your cattle might get sick. Your children might fall ill with a fever that no doctor can explain. In a world this harsh, you needed all the help you could get. And this is where the experts came in. When people were in need, they didn't always turn to the priest. They turned to the experts in their midst, practitioners of folk religion. These people had many names: wizards, cunning men, cunning women, conjurers, or sorcerers. The only thing they all had in common was that they possessed arcane knowledge that they kept secret. Some of them used herbal remedies. Others employed potions, spells, or even astrological predictions. If you were lovesick, they had a cure. If you were angry with your neighbor, they had a hex. If you desperately needed a son to inherit your property, or just wanted to know how a business venture would turn out, these were the people you visited. This wasn't seen as dark magic by the average person. It was just necessary. It was a survival strategy. But there was another source of supernatural power in town, and they weren't happy about the competition. See, for the common person in the 15th century, there wasn't a huge distinction between church magic and traditional folk remedies. It was all just power that could help you survive. The church had its own form of magic. The most regular form was the Mass. During this service, the priest would take bread and wine and consecrate them. The belief was that, by doing so, he transubstantiated them into the actual body and blood of Christ. This was viewed as a priestly miracle. People believed these elements possessed holy power. In fact, some worshippers would actually take the consecrated bread away from the church instead of eating it, just so they could use it as a charm. The church also encouraged a very materialistic approach to the supernatural by sponsoring the veneration of holy relics. These were items supposedly associated with Christ or the saints. Pilgrims would flock to shrines to look at, touch, or even kiss cases containing things like a finger of saint, Peter, or a fragment of wood from the true cross. Let me give you a specific example of how powerful this church magic was believed to be. In 1483, William Caxton published The Golden Legend, a collection of miracle stories. It recorded a story about the city of Catania and its local martyr, Saint Agatha. According to the legend, a year after Saint Agatha's death, the mountain looming over the city erupted. A river of fire and molten rock, lava, spewed down toward the city. The pagans in the city were terrified. They fled to the saint's tomb, snatched up the cloth that covered it, and hung it directly in the path of the fire. And guess what happened? The stream of lava halted. It didn't advance a foot farther. This was the environment of the time. A holy veil could stop a volcano. A piece of bread could be a charm. And a cunning woman could cure your cow. In fact, the help you received from a village healer often contained religious elements. It wasn't anti-Christian. For instance, in the 1550s, there was a cunning woman in Somerset named Joan Tiry. She would prescribe herbs to treat a person who was bewitched. But she insisted that those herbs had to be gathered while reciting 5 paternosters, 5 Ave Marias, and a creed. The lines were blurred, but the church was about to sharpen them. As we moved deeper into the Renaissance, things began to change drastically. There was a rising tide of skepticism in Europe that was threatening to seep into the foundations of the medieval church. People were starting to question the power of the priesthood. They were questioning the moral standards of its representatives. You had Renaissance thinkers like Marsilio Ficino, who, while remaining devout Catholics, were speculating about connections between Christianity, Islamic thought, and Jewish thought. The Catholic faith was coming under pressure from all directions. The church felt it needed to fight back vigorously to wrest control of men's minds from heresy and unorthodox beliefs. Led by Pope Innocent VIII, the church sought to disentangle itself from popular magic. They needed to draw a hard line. The message went out: any supernatural power that did not have official ecclesiastical backing came not from God but from Satan. This is the moment the cunning woman became the witch. In 1486, that famous book dropped, the Malleus Maleficarum, written by 2 Dominican friars. It was a compendious description and denunciation of witchcraft. This book was dangerous because it changed the narrative. It asserted that all practitioners of folk religion, those healers and cunning folk we talked about, had sold their souls. It stripped away the nuance. Joan Tiry wasn't just a helpful neighbor using prayers and herbs anymore. In the eyes of this book, she was in league with the devil. The Malleus Maleficarum laid down specific rules for interrogation, conviction, and punishment of suspects. It provided the legal and theological framework to hunt these people down. Now, here is a fascinating historical twist. You might think that the moment this book was published, the bonfires were lit across Europe immediately. But actually, it didn't become the primary weapon in the persecutors' armory for another century. It was a slow burn. Its true importance lies in what it reveals about the intellectual climate of the time. It showed a church that was terrified of losing its monopoly on the supernatural. It showed an elite class that was ready to demonize the survival strategies of the poor to maintain control. The Malleus Maleficarum stands as a chilling testament to the power of propaganda. It took the diverse, complex world of folk medicine, where herbs met prayers and healers met priests, and flattened it into a binary war between God and Satan. By the time the witch trials truly ramped up in the following centuries, the blueprint had already been drawn by those 2 friars in 1486. They turned neighbors into enemies and healers into heretics. The tragedy is that the people who suffered most were often just trying to help their community survive in a world that was short, brutal, and full of pain. They were the ones who knew which herbs could break a fever. But history, written by the victors, or in this case the Inquisitors, branded them as monsters. If you want to dive deeper into the specific spells and herbs these cunning folk actually used, or if you want a video on the specific trials that followed this book, let me know in the comments below.